Up until this point, there have been two attempts to bring Dune to the big screen, one regarded as largely successful, the other less so. But what a lot of people don't know is that there was actually an adaptation that came out between these two behemoths, one that sought to bring Frank Herbert's works to life on the small screen. With well over 8 hours of collective runtime, an incredibly passionate creative team, and an unfailing insistence to try and adapt these works as closely to the books as possible, the early 2000s sci-fi Dune adaptations are entirely unique. Between some excellent choices and some not-so-excellent special effects, Frank Herbert's Dune and Frank Herbert's Children of Dune have shaped the legacy of this story in a way that I'm not sure a lot of people are aware of. Just a quick warning that this video is going to contain spoilers for most of Dune. I don't get into a whole lot of specifics, but I will be talking about overarching picture things for Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune. So if you want to go into Villeneuve's third Dune movie with absolutely no information about how Dune Messiah goes and what happens in Dune Messiah or Children of Dune, this is not the video for you. And an even more brief warning, you need to go and check out this video's sponsor, ZocDoc. I've got to be honest with you guys, I am really bad at making myself appointments, especially doctor's appointments. The moment that I get on the phone with a stranger, my body starts reacting like I'm being hunted for sport, and I can never figure out how to fit an appointment into my schedule or how to find a doctor that I can trust. For the longest time, I was just putting off making any doctor's appointments at all, but with this video's sponsor, ZocDoc, I was able to find a doctor, make an appointment, and check that off my to-do list. ZocDoc is a free website where you can search and compare high-quality, in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click to instantly book an appointment. From mental health to dentistry, eye care, skincare, and everything in between. ZocDoc makes it easy to book in-network appointments with more than 100,000 healthcare providers. With ZocDoc, you can filter for doctors by insurance, location, and specialties, and see reviews by verified patients, so you can choose the best, most convenient care for you. When you found the doctor you need, you can see their actual appointment times, choose a time that works best for you, and instantly book yourself a visit with just a few clicks. Plus, ZocDoc helps you get appointments fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you can even score same-day appointments. No need to call doctors' offices and wait on hold either. ZocDoc lets you do everything online so you can quickly make an appointment and get on with your day. Stop waiting around and guessing like I have, and get yourself the care that you need. Just go to ZocDoc.com/JessOfTheShire to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That is ZocDoc.com/JessOfTheShire to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Thanks so much to ZocDoc for partnering with us, and let's get back to the video. After the near-complete failure of David Lynch's 1984 Dune adaptation, the franchise was in a very precarious place. Despite being a beloved cult classic, at this time Dune was still weird nerd stuff, and in a world that was about to produce the Star Wars prequel films, this incredibly dense, typically considered unfilmable piece of property that had just had a very public flop was not particularly ripe for the picking. But this meant that a whole generation of Dune fans had seen the David Lynch film and thought that they could do better. So it was that a little over a decade after the 1984 Dune film came out, producer Richard Rubinstein began looking around for people to give him funding for a Dune miniseries to be broadcast on the Sci-Fi Channel on the small screen in people's homes. Rubinstein had a couple of reasons for thinking that he could do what David Lynch could not. First off, the structure of the miniseries was much more forgiving. He was basically pitching 3 90-minute movies, which would run in sequence one night after another. This meant that he had way more time and space to develop the story and actually tell the entirety of the story, which already was a pretty long book. Plus, with a budget that was less than half the size of the David Lynch movie, they were putting much less on the line. And then, of course, we have to consider the way in which this movie was being distributed. The problem that Dune ran into, and the problem that all science fiction and fantasy movies with a big theatrical release run into, is that they have to win over an audience that doesn't necessarily like science fiction. They have to win over the average theater goer, which can be very difficult with something as dense and weird as Dune. But the Dune miniseries was going to air on the Sci-Fi Channel, which already had a built-in audience of people that, if they weren't familiar with Dune, would at least be open to enjoying something as heavy science fiction as Dune. Even with all of these contributing factors, it took Rubinstein 3 years to gather funding, but eventually the project was greenlit, with director John Harrison at the helm. Harrison had begun his career in acting, but eventually pivoted to a directorial role, directing films like Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. He had loved Herbert's work since college, and went into this film with the goal of adapting the Dune book as faithfully as he possibly could. But that was not going to be an easy task, especially considering that for the longest time, Dune had been called unfilmable. The world building of Dune is heavy. Herbert didn't just create a planet, he created an entire universe with its own governments, its own social systems, its own rules, its own laws, its own history, its own plans within plans and schemes within schemes. He created an entire ecosystem nearly alien to our own. And in a book, it's pretty easy to stop the action for a side tangent on what a mentat is, or why spice is so important, but it's less easy to do that in a film. Sure, things like prologues and voiceovers are a good start, but you can't use those very much in a film without it getting clumsy, and there's far too much information to pack in just using those tools. And in the miniseries, Harrison and his team took a multi-pronged approach to this issue. They adjusted characters like Paul and even Lady Jessica to make them far more inquisitive. Rather than just already knowing everything as they do in the book, they ask questions, they sit and listen through explanations, and thus the audience learns alongside them. They were also able to use Princess Irulan as a masterful tool for exposition. In the books, Irulan's presence is almost entirely on the margins. She exists in the little snippets that head chapters, which are excerpts from the histories that she would later write. Her first actual physical appearance is at the very end of the novel when she gets married off to Paul. The miniseries deviates from this course, introducing her early in Part 1, in the infamous banquet scene. This scene, which has been cut from every other adaptation, is much beloved by both Herbert and the fans. While it's polite and mannerly on the surface, the wildly switching perspectives of the scene show how every character there has an ulterior motive. Every conversation has at least 3 layers to it, and integrating Irulan into this scene was a genius move because it puts her at the very heart of the political machinations. It gives her the chance to see the roots of trouble on Arrakis, it introduces her to and allows her to sympathize with Paul. Throughout the rest of the story, Harrison keeps bringing us back to Irulan and her father, the Emperor, as Irulan tries to untangle the web of politics and deceit wrapped around Dune. Not only does this keep her from feeling like a convenient plot device, a deus ex machina that pops up at the very end of the book, it also means that the audience has a surrogate character. Someone who is untangling the mysteries just like they are, so that they're not left trying to sum it all up in a voiceover to keep everyone on track. Another issue that they needed to navigate was how much of Dune occurs internally. The story is fueled by internal monologues. Basically, none of the characters allow any of their emotions to show on the surface, and the deep philosophy that keeps the story moving forward is almost never outwardly expressed. It's all experienced in the inside. Any adaptation is going to have to wrestle with making these internal schemes be visible outwardly to an audience. Now, filmmakers like David Lynch took one approach with that.
I've got to try to grab it. The suspensor field will make it slippery on the bottom. I must grip it tightly.
But Harrison tried a different tactic. I felt it would be better to externalize those thoughts and feelings in scenes where the action told you the same thing, or said it through dialogue. This was all part of the inevitable condensations one has to make when turning an incredibly rich novel into a movie. Perhaps the most difficult pill to swallow about Frank Herbert's Dune novel is that it's really weird. The cultural conception around Dune has kind of become one of seeing it as very austere and epic, but I think that there's actually a lot of zaniness in the original novel that's been filtered out by people's desire to focus on the things that they found important, the themes and the philosophical import. There are orgies, there are comedically foul villains, there are plans within plans within plans within plans within plans to the point of absurdity, and overall, there's just a lot more 1960s science fiction wackiness than most adaptations have been willing to capture. But to its absolute credit, the Dune miniseries throws itself headfirst into this weirdness, for better and for worse. The costumes, for example, are insane. From purple mylar jumpsuits to incredible headdresses, butterfly gowns, pseudo-Japanese cosplay to this whole situation, the costumes feel absolutely out of this world in a very cheesy 1960s meets early 2000s kind of way. Now, I won't try and argue that every costume is a hit. I think that a lot of them look cheap and a lot of them look weird just for the sake of being weird rather than looking good. But you know what I will say? These costumes definitely keep you engaged. But they aren't the only place in which they lean into the weird. The filmmakers embraced things like orgies, bizarre dream sequences, the inhuman guild navigators, and of course, these guys.
The guild does not take your orders.
Now look, here's the thing. I love the weirdness. It's probably my favorite thing about this miniseries, and just compared to how, serious and intense so much of our, prestige television is today, it's very refreshing to see something that is unequivocally strange. But all of that being said, I do think that there are possibly points in which the weirdness gets in the way of actually telling the story that they were trying to tell. At the very climax of this story, when the fate of the known universe is being decided, I probably shouldn't find myself giggling. But I also can't help but feel like this weirdness is almost more faithful to the original novel, or at the very least the period of time into which it was born. I love the very serious, more brutalist side of Dune, but adaptations like this don't let you forget that Dune is, at its very core, weirdly psychosexual 1960s science fiction. And while we are going to get around to critiquing this adaptation plenty, I do want to say a couple more nice things about it. The cast is overall pretty solid, with standout performances from actors like William Hurt and Ian McNeice. McNeice plays probably my favorite version of the Baron that has yet been captured on screen. He's not as abhorrent as David Lynch's Baron, or as mortally terrifying as Villeneuve's, and he somehow manages to make this villain kind of charming in an off-putting way. He's still infuriating, of course, but his Shakespearean grandeur is kind of perfectly over the top. They even end all of his scenes with a rhyming couplet, which I hated at first, and it made me want to punch him, but then I realized that I should want to punch that character. So I guess it was a good move. Julie Cox as Irulan was another standout for me, and the rest of the cast was serviceable for most of the story. I will say that anytime an adaptation of Dune casts absolutely no people of color, anywhere in the film, not even in background characters or extras or any of the Fremen, it feels a little bit weird just for a story that's so obviously ripped off of people of color's culture. To not cast any people of color feels weird, but beyond that kind of stuff, which is just very much of its time, unfortunately, the cast was pretty okay. Now granted, all of the acting is done in a very 90s soap opera kind of style, but that's not necessarily bad, it's just a stylistic choice. I really think that because this adaptation made such bold choices, whether or not you like it is going to come down to your personal taste. And according to my personal taste, there are quite a few things in this adaptation that I didn't like. Despite astonishingly winning 2 Emmy Awards, one for cinematography and one for special effects, the special effects of this film are quite possibly what has aged the worst. And the most complained about manifestation of this is probably the backdrops. When they realized that shooting in a desert outside would be too costly and too risky and complicated, they decided that they would shoot the entire film indoors on a soundstage in Prague. And they did absolutely the best with what they had. They built some really nice sets, they carted in so much sand that they almost collapsed a studio floor, but the problem is that Dune is all about the environment. It's all about the ecology of the planet and these big, vast landscapes and worlds. And when you have everything occurring indoors, I think you kind of lose that specialness. In order to complete their vision, they relied on their cinematographer, Vittore Storaro. Now, Storaro was a legit guy. He won an Academy Award for his work on Apocalypse Now, which is why I think that it was probably the budget of this miniseries that kneecapped his work. Some of the scenes are backed by beautiful matte paintings, but many more are just photoshopped printed backdrops. And the overall effect is, let's just say it requires a very willing suspension of disbelief to really immerse yourself in the scene. At times, this effect feels kind of cute and quaint, like watching a cheap 80s sci-fi show or a high school play, and there are other times that it starts to feel like a parody of itself. I noticed pretty early on that in any of the desert scenes, or really any of the scenes altogether where they're running away from things, they only ever run about 10 feet before they have to stop and change direction or pant or have a conversation and stuff, and that's probably just because they were limited by the size of the sound studios that they were working on. And look, I have sympathy for them. I have also tried to make projects happen before, and it's really expensive and really hard to shoot outside, so they were working within the limitations that they had, and I don't think they did an atrocious job. But again, Dune is all about these environments and worlds, and the world just doesn't quite get carried across very well when you're surrounded by paper backdrops. This series manages to look decent in its indoor scenes or its city scenes where they could really build out the world, but any digitally generated graphics that they used just do not look great to the modern eye. The worms in particular I took umbrage with because every time they move, they just look really slow somehow. Unavoidably, it all just kind of looks like an old video game in many parts. Now, for me personally, I don't really mind bad graphics. I think they're kind of cute sometimes. I watched Doctor Who, so you know, my taste may be very particular, but I know that a lot of people, the graphics are the first complaint they list about this series, so clearly it's something that other people are not super huge fans of. One aspect of the special effects that I really found impressive, for the most part, was the eyes. They didn't have the time or budget to go back in post and digitally rotoscope in the blue-on-blue eyes of the Fremen people, so instead they fitted their main actors and some of the background actors with contact lenses that were fluorescent blue. In shots where they wanted the Fremen eyes to be noticeable, they would put black lights behind the cameras so that the actors' eyes would fluoresce. This effect is the most stunning presentation of the eyes of Ibad that I've ever seen. It is absolutely striking, and I do think it's a genius move, except for the fact that sometimes it didn't work. The problem is that they made such a strikingly vivid effect for these eyes, which means that it's really obvious when it's not working quite as well. In group shots or distance shots, you often see that the people's eyes aren't blue at all when they were in the last scene. In quite a few shots, only one of the actors' eyes would catch the light, and thus only one of their eyes would be blue. It doesn't detract from the plot, obviously, but it does come across as rather clumsy to our modern eyes. Beyond just the production side of things, though, I do have some problems with their storytelling choices. In particular, the choices made around the character of Paul and the casting choice of Alec Newman. Now, this is no hate to Alec Newman's performance. I think that in the later episodes, even in episode 2 and 3, and in the second miniseries when he's playing an older and more commanding Paul, I think he does an excellent job of carrying across those choices. But when he's playing a teenage boy, things start to fall apart a little bit. Now, this was always going to be a really tricky thing. Harrison wanted to cast one actor to play Paul Atreides, and he didn't want to be working with a teenager, but that means that he cast Alec Newman, who was, at the time of filming, 25 years old. And again, this meant he was really well suited to playing Paul later in the book and in later books, but it meant he was really poorly equipped to play Paul at the beginning, especially because for some reason in the writing, they made Paul far more whiny and petulant than he ever was in the book. In the book, Paul is constantly praised for being so mature for his age. He's constantly called an old soul. Liat Kynes points out his sense of command and his poised assurance. Jessica praises him for his dignity, and a stranger literally comments, "Young Paul Atreides, still a lad by his looks, but a man by his actions." By contrast, Newman's Paul is a man by his looks, and a whiny little lad by his actions. This version of Paul pouts and storms off from an important dinner. He asks questions about things that he should by all rights already be aware of, and he acts, well, like a 15-year-old boy. Now, I don't hate this choice altogether. I think that in another adaptation with a different cast, this could be played in a really interesting way. And I understand that they wanted to put Paul in a place where he could be gathering information as the audience is. But when you have a 25-year-old man playing a 15-year-old like he's 10 years old, storming off on a temper tantrum, it just really put me off of the first part of this story. And that's a real shame, because I actually think that the first part of this story, at least on a thematic level, is probably the best done out of the 3 parts of this miniseries. You can feel the menace building, the plans developing, this trap slowly enclosing the Atreides family. The second half does not build these themes quite as well. You see, this adaptation is a really solid, often word-for-word adaptation of the first book. But the problem with the first book is that although the groundwork is laid and the themes are subtly built, the book does end and could leave you with the impression that Paul is the good guy. Just in case you weren't aware, he's not. Paul is not really a particularly good guy. It could be debated whether or not he's a villain. Anyway, the whole theme of the story, as established by Herbert in later writing, is the idea that a singular, all-powerful leader is not a good thing and cannot be healthy for human society. And this is a theme he begins to build out in Dune, but he learned, after the publication of the first book, that a lot of readers didn't quite see that. And a lot of readers thought that Paul's victory was a good thing, that he was the hero, and that it was a good thing that he won. And this is why Herbert wrote Dune Messiah. It was an attempt to take the themes that he had begun to work into Dune and really bring them to their completion, to show the result of Paul's despotic rule. Now, the issue here is that the groundwork of themes that Herbert starts building in Dune are almost completely missing from this miniseries adaptation. Paul's visions are creepy, yes, but they never make it clear that his ascendance could be anything but a victory. Aaliyah is a weird little kid, but they never establish what it means for her to be pre-born, the kind of evil that has brought into her life. They show Kynes' death as it was in the book, mourning that his own beloved ecology has come to kill him, but the larger bend and the larger message of that scene is missing. In the book, the scene plays out as Kynes hallucinates his father, who's explaining the ecology of Arrakis, and how they have come to manipulate it as the planetary ecologists. But as the scene progresses, he pivots, and it becomes clear that just as Arrakis' ecology seems to be this vast, untouchable thing, but is actually very easy to manipulate by manipulating the people within that ecology, so the entire universe may be put out of balance by a single person. His final damning claim is, "No more terrible disaster could befall your people than for them to fall into the hands of a hero." This is a beautifully done bit of foreshadowing, and it's completely skimmed out of the miniseries. By the end of the series, we're left with no reason to believe that Paul and his universal jihad are anything but a net positive. It is an uncomplicated and unnuanced victory for Paul the good guy. Now, is this a moderately faithful, surface-level reading of the plot events of the first Dune book? Yes. However, is it also a huge disservice to the larger message that Herbert was crafting throughout the arc of his novels? I would also say yes. But despite my complaints, I cannot deny that this series proved successful. The initial broadcast pulled in over 4 million views, reruns continued to be popular, and this was all enough for them to greenlight a sequel. Released in 2003, this would be another 3-movie miniseries broadcast on the Sci-Fi Channel, attempting to adapt Frank Herbert's second and third novel, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. Now, this is interesting because despite the fact that Dune had already been adapted previously, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune had never been attempted before, and Denis Villeneuve is only planning on going up to Messiah, which means that this may very well be the only adaptation we get of Children of Dune. Harrison was brought back in to write this series, but was unable to direct due to scheduling conflicts, so they brought in a new director, Greg Yaitens? I'm really bad with pronouncing names. I'm so sorry, Greg. Many of the same cast members also returned for this miniseries, including Alec Newman as Paul, but there were a lot of fresh faces too, including Susan Sarandon and an early in his career James McAvoy. And I would say that this second miniseries is overall decent. At least on the production side, it is a marked improvement from the first miniseries. The backgrounds aren't quite as obtrusive, the eyes were done digitally this time, and thus have far less issues, although it does have its little moments of early CGI awkwardness. The costumes are somewhat toned down, but still neat, the performances are a bit more grounded, and it does feel like they learned quite a bit about making a Dune adaptation during the first series. The story is once again split into 3 movie-length episodes, the first one covering Herbert's Dune Messiah, and the second 2 covering the story of the Children of Dune. And to their credit, on a story level, on a surface level, they managed to hit most of the beats from these 2 novels, which is pretty impressive. But once again, I found them under-delivering on themes. And I think that the issue they encountered is that because they had not built the foundation of their themes in the first miniseries, they had nothing to go off of for the second. For example, let's look at the character of Duncan Idaho. Duncan Idaho has a relatively short run in the first book, but the scenes that he does have are emotionally charged and significant. In the miniseries, he has like 2.5 scenes altogether, and none of them are particularly emotionally fraught. In the book, he dies when he is protecting Paul and Jessica after the fall of Arrakeen. He's single-handedly fighting off Sardaukar soldiers, and he manages to kill 19 of them before he goes down, still snarling. In the miniseries, however, he gets blown up off-screen. Duncan's presence can be felt haunting the rest of the book, in the advice he gives, in dreams, and in memories, and he is never brought up again in the miniseries. Huge spoilers for Dune Messiah in the next 10 seconds here, but when Duncan is brought back as a Ghola in Dune Messiah, in the books this is a hugely emotionally impactful thing. We understand Paul's emotional relationship to Duncan, and thus there's a reason that he was brought back to emotionally manipulate Paul. In the miniseries, because they had not built that emotional groundwork between Paul and Duncan, his return means nothing. Paul's arc likewise feels pretty stunted. We get the sense that his growing power was difficult to deal with, but we never got the struggle behind that, the years of trouble as Paul watched himself unwittingly be turned into a god. That is all missing from the miniseries. In the Dune book, we are constantly hearing what Paul is becoming, the legend that he's becoming, the story that he's becoming, and how Paul can immediately sense that that is not a good thing. At the climax of the story, he thinks to himself, Paul saw how futile were any efforts of his to change the smallest bit of this. He had thought to oppose the jihad within himself, but the jihad would be. His legions would rage out from Arrakis even without him. They needed only the legend he already had become. He had shown them the way, given them mastery even over the guild, which must have the spice to exist. A sense of failure pervaded him. This remarkably paradoxical feeling of helplessness, which is so sharply at odds with the absolute power that Paul has ascended to, is completely missing from the miniseries. And so when this feeling reaches its zenith in Messiah, when it becomes the driving conflict in Messiah, the whole thing feels completely without context. This also means that Leto II, Paul's son, who takes up this torch of angst from his father and carries it to its completion, he also has no arc to build upon. The whole point of Leto II's arc is that he's struggling with whether or not he should take up the golden path, whether he can complete the work that his father, as an individual, was unable to complete. But the miniseries leaves us just with the general notion that power is bad, and the understanding that Leto is struggling because power's bad, but he needs to take it for some reason. The rich, philosophical, ecological themes that power the story are left without any steam, and the story kind of sputters to an end. The ending of the miniseries ends up being almost a happy ending, or almost feeling like a happy ending, almost completely missing the sense of foreboding and doom that so characterizes Herbert's best books. Now, Children of Dune does do an excellent job of technically portraying all of the elements of the story and making the changes that they needed to make. Irulan is removed from her role as a conspirator during Dune Messiah, allowing her to transition much more naturally into the stepmother role later on. To fill that gap, they enlarged the role of Wenzisha from later books, and Susan Sarandon plays her masterfully. The twins are given more time to actually act like kids, like the teenagers that they portray them as, and Aaliyah's story is given a bit more meat to work with. My absolute favorite scenes from the second miniseries were the scenes between two Bene Gesserit sisters, when they would be carrying across one conversation out loud while having the real conversation through their hand signals, which were spelled out by captions. The scenes like that, where you can see this plotting unfolding before you, the layers of stories, of plans within plans, were just electric. Overall, this was quite a competent production. Alec Newman's performance hits its stride in Messiah, Leto and Ghanima are just as unnerving as they should be, Aaliyah and the Baron's possession scenes are deliciously creepy and tragic. We even drew out some emotional beats that I found quite compelling. But, and I say this as someone who is admittedly going to be a bit harsh because Children of Dune is my favorite Frank Herbert book, I'm not sure that this miniseries resonated emotionally with me in the same way that the Children of Dune book does. When I think about Children of Dune, the thing that I loved about it was not the actual surface plot elements. It wasn't necessarily the characters or what happens to them or the schemes within schemes. It was the philosophy. There is a literal conflict playing out in this story, one that the miniseries captures quite well, but it mostly glanced off of the underlying conflict at play here, this strain between the individual and the greater good, the difference between right and wrong, and how those lines can be blurred. And if these two miniseries were the only adaptation of Dune that we had ever gotten, I may be sitting here having the opinion that this was the best we could possibly do. That it was just impossible to fully adapt the themes and to fully get across the message of Frank Herbert's later books in the story of Dune on screen. Unfortunately, for the sake of these miniseries, after they came out, there has been another Dune film made. That has not just proved that it's possible to integrate these themes into a filmic format, but it has also proven that these themes make for incredible cinema. I do think it is genuinely unfair to try and seriously compare this miniseries to the Denis Villeneuve films. It's absolutely just apples to oranges. Even adjusted for inflation, Villeneuve is working with over 4 times the budget that Harrison was working with, and with 25 years of advancement in CGI technology. It was inevitable that the Denis Villeneuve films were going to look way better than this miniseries could have hoped to. But all of that aside, I think that removing just production elements, we can compare the way that they chose to tell tell these stories, because it is clear from the outset that Harrison and Denis Villeneuve had very different goals for why they wanted to adapt Dune in the first place. Harrison wanted to recreate the novel. This means capturing its layers of intrigue, its remarkably thorough world building, the silly and the space operatic, but this also means translating the hit or miss, often very plodding pace, the inconsistency of themes across the books, and the parts of Herbert's world that haven't aged as well. This is the exact opposite of Villeneuve's approach. He wanted to make this story his own. Villeneuve cuts things from his story savagely, refusing to over-explain anything, especially the world building. He wants to make his audience work for it, refusing to spell things out, telling almost 50% of the story through visual storytelling language alone. And that's why I think that especially the first Denis Villeneuve Dune film bounced off of so many people, why so many people thought it looked like a 3-hour perfume commercial, because they were not ready for that kind of visual storytelling language. It's not the kind of media that they enjoy, or that they've been primed to enjoy. It is a movie that really wants you to dig in, to look behind the story that they are telling on the surface level, and in relying on that, Villeneuve leaves out a lot of moments, even some of the most beloved moments from the book. But this very intentional, very efficient style of storytelling means that he has set himself up perfectly to tell the Dune Messiah story that he wants to adapt in the third movie. All of the groundwork has been laid out in Paul's character, his relationships, the world that Villeneuve has created. The dominoes are lined up and ready to fall in a way that I believe will provide precisely the emotional gut punch that Herbert had originally been after. Is he going about this in the same way that Frank Herbert did? No, of course not. He's telling a new story for a new audience in a completely new era. But if you want an exact word-for-word adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune, I got good news. You have the miniseries right here. So much of Villeneuve's style of storytelling relies on visual language and cinematography to tell you what's happening in the story. The miniseries relies on dialogue to serve that same purpose. You're left feeling like the miniseries is like, a theater production. A pretty good theater production, but Villeneuve's feels like, you know, a movie. And making a movie that really feels like a movie, it seems, sometimes means straying from the original writing of the book. Because there are parts of the miniseries which are pulled directly from the books that prove just how awkward some parts of the book are. Having Aaliyah as a toddler running around killing people with knives is awesome, but it is also pretty goofy, and I find that it deflates some of the dramatic tension. In the book and in the miniseries, Paul and Chani have an entire human child together somewhere in the midpoint of Dune, and he's killed off before we even see him interacting with Paul at all, and it just feels like such a weird non-starter. It's like, oh yeah, we had a kid, but he's dead now, and neither of us are really gonna be seriously emotionally impacted by that thing happening to us. And I know this next one might be a little bit of a hot button issue, but I really don't love the character of Chani as she's presented in the book and in the miniseries. I really feel like she got the short end of the stick. When we're first introduced to her, she's in this warrior setting. She's giving Paul fighting tips and handing him a knife, and she's so cool and aloof and badass. And then the second that Paul is like, oh, well, we're destined to be together and for you to be the mother of my children, she folds, and it seems like she gives up on everything that she was working for before, and her only goal is to stay at home, raise children, and then have more children and make people coffee. Now, say what you will about Villeneuve's presentation of Chani, and I don't know where it's going because I have not seen movie 3 yet, but it is definitely new. He makes changes that are grounded in the basis of her character as it was first introduced, following through with her character in a way that Herbert did not, and it's allowing for something incredibly unique. Longtime fans of Dune who know the story in and out are waiting for movie 3 with anticipation, because Villeneuve is going to do something new with this story. He's going to be able to surprise them. But you know, for all of the complaints that I have about this miniseries, it really just cannot be understated how significant it was in shaping the legacy of Dune as a whole. After all, these two miniseries are still in the top 3 most watched things that the Sci-Fi Channel has ever made. Although they never quite became pop culture hits, these miniseries proved to studios and producers and audiences alike that Dune was not, in fact, unfilmable. If all that we had of the Dune on film legacy was David Lynch's Dune film, I am really skeptical that Denis Villeneuve would have been able to get the funding and the support for the Dune movies that he is now making. And in terms of faithfulness, I think that these miniseries were a really important stepping stone in proving that faithfulness to the source material of Dune is not all that is required for creating a good Dune adaptation. If you are on the lookout for perfect science fiction television, I will freely admit that this show is not that. But honestly, I feel like the modern standard for sci-fi and fantasy television has gotten so high as of the last couple years or the last decade or so that it's not really fair to look at a series like this and say that it's not up to par with our modern taste. Of course it's not. Our taste has advanced so rapidly in the last 25 years. Would I rank this show in my top 10 television shows of all time? Absolutely not. But would I watch the whole, 4 to 9 hour experience again, especially with friends or family who like the story of Dune and don't mind giggling about it a bit? Yeah, of course I would. Without the existence of this miniseries, I don't think that Dune would have the reputation or renown that it enjoys today. I know a lot of people whose very first exposure to Dune was this miniseries, and if the Denis Villeneuve Dune movies had not been made, I think that these would stand the test of time as the very best adaptation of Dune that had ever been made. Is it awkward at times, and maybe a little bit goofy? Yeah, of course it is, but frankly I think the same could be said about the Dune book itself. While these kind of ridiculous, campy, made-for-TV movies may seem just like a couple of blips in the history of what is becoming one of the most significant sci-fi franchises of our time, I do think it's important to remember just how important a blip can be in the stories that we tell. In the comments, let me know if you've watched this series, and if you have, let me know what you thought. And if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend that you check them out, at least the first episode of either series, just to get a taste for it. I will say, and you didn't hear this from me, the whole first miniseries and some of the second is currently up on YouTube. If you want to check it out before you invest in buying an entire DVD box set, that's a really great way to do it, and you'll have to come back to this video and let me know what you thought. Huge shout out to my father, who is the biggest Dune fan that I know, who let me borrow his copy of the box sets for both of these, the director's cut for the first miniseries, and yes, I did watch this whole thing in 2 days, and it's done unspeakable damage to my brain. So anyway, give this video a like, and do consider subscribing, and send this video to the biggest Dune fan in your life. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and even if this is a sci-fi related video, I can still wish you a very happy, hobbity day.